What if I told you there was once a woman who convinced billionaires, scientists, and even a former U.S. Secretary of State that she had cracked one of medicine's greatest challenges? That from a single drop of blood, she could unlock hundreds of test results in minutes. Imagine a world where you never had to face long hospital lines, painful needles, or expensive lab bills again. She promised to change the world, to save lives, to make healthcare as simple as downloading an app. And for a while, she made everyone believe she had done it. But what if that promise, that billion-dollar vision, was never real to begin with? What if the story that captured the world's attention was nothing but a carefully constructed illusion, one built not on science, but on storytelling? Because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how Elizabeth Holmes built one of the most convincing mirages in Silicon Valley history, and how it all came crashing down. Elizabeth Holmes didn't look like a typical tech founder. She wasn't loud or flamboyant. She wasn't the kind of person who filled a room with noise or ego, but somehow, when she walked in, people paid attention. There was something almost hypnotic about her presence, calm, controlled, deliberate. Her words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were confident. She spoke slowly, intentionally, as if every syllable had been tested in a lab before being released into the air. Her voice was soft, yet strangely commanding, the kind that made even seasoned executives lean in to listen. From the very beginning, Elizabeth stood out. She dropped out of Stanford at just 19 years old, leaving behind one of the most prestigious universities in the world with a singular, almost obsessive mission: to change the world through science. People who met her during those early days described her as intense, laser-focused, and almost impossibly certain of what she wanted to achieve. There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt in her eyes. When she spoke about her idea, it didn't sound like ambition. It sounded like destiny. That idea would come to be known as Theranos, a word she created by merging therapy and diagnosis. It sounded futuristic, scientific, almost poetic. The name itself carried promise, a word that felt like it belonged in the next century. And what Theranos promised was nothing short of revolutionary. Holmes envisioned a world where a single drop of blood could unlock hundreds of test results in minutes. No needles, no vials, no painful pricks or anxious waiting. Just one drop from your fingertip, and you'd know everything about your health. Cancer, cholesterol, infections, all detected instantly, cheaply, and conveniently. It was the kind of vision that could change everything. Imagine pharmacies and clinics across the country offering instant, painless testing. Imagine early disease detection, saving millions of lives. Imagine the power shifting from hospitals and labs to the hands of ordinary people. That's the story Elizabeth told, and the world wanted to believe her. The idea sounded too good to be true, but it also sounded too good to ignore. What made Holmes even more compelling was the way she embodied her mission. She wasn't just talking about changing healthcare. She looked like someone who could. She carried herself in eerie calm, a quiet certainty that made skepticism feel like cynicism. She rarely blinked, rarely smiled, and rarely broke character. Every movement, every word, every outfit was calculated to build her image as a visionary. But here's the thing. Elizabeth Holmes understood something that most people don't. In a world drowning in noise, in a world where everyone is fighting to be heard, it's not always the truth that wins, it's attention. And Elizabeth Holmes mastered the science of attention. She understood that to change the world, first you had to capture it. She realized that people don't invest in data, they invest in stories. Facts can inform, but stories inspire. And so she became a storyteller. She built a narrative so powerful that even the most skeptical minds wanted it to be real. She wasn't just a scientist or a CEO. She became a symbol. The rare female founder who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Silicon Valley's most celebrated men. She modeled herself after her idol, Steve Jobs. The black turtleneck wasn't just a fashion choice. It was armor. It told the world, I'm not just another entrepreneur. I'm a visionary. She mirrored his minimalist aesthetic, his piercing eye contact, even his deliberate pauses when speaking. It wasn't mimicry, it was strategy. She studied how Jobs had turned Apple into not just a company, but a movement, and she applied that same principle to Theranos. Her language was the language of revolution. She didn't talk about products or devices. She talked about missions, paradigm shifts, and transforming humanity. Her words were filled with emotional gravity, phrases that made investors and audiences feel like they were part of something historic. And in that sense, she wasn't just selling a product. She was selling a revolution. Every public appearance was deliberate. Every interview, every magazine cover, every speech was crafted to reinforce the myth. Holmes wasn't presenting data. She was presenting destiny. She didn't just speak to investors. She spoke to their dreams. She didn't just appeal to doctors. She appealed to their humanity. And the genius of it all was that the more she spoke, the more people stopped questioning whether she could do it and started believing she already had. Elizabeth Holmes became the story she created. The image of the calm, visionary woman in the black turtleneck wasn't an accident. It was a foundation of an empire built on belief. She didn't just understand attention. She weaponized it. And that's how a 19-year-old dropout convinced the world that she had reinvented medicine. She spoke with a deep, almost hypnotic voice, saying things like, "The minute you have a revolutionary technology, either changing the world or you're being attacked." It was a kind of statement that positioned her as both hero and victim, a classic narrative that invites empathy and loyalty. Investors didn't just see a founder. They saw the next icon of innovation, a rare female genius in a male-dominated tech world. They poured money into Theranos, hundreds of millions. At its peak, the company was valued at over $9 billion, making Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world. And yet, behind the spotless glass walls of Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto, the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. From the outside, the building gleamed with the polish of Silicon Valley success. White walls, quiet hallways, an almost sacred atmosphere of innovation. Visitors described it as something between a tech temple and a secret lab, a place where science and genius supposedly intertwined. But behind those doors, the illusion began to crack. The sleek devices that Elizabeth Holmes promised could run hundreds of medical tests from a single drop of blood, devices that had dazzled investors and charmed the press, didn't actually work. Not even close. They were called Edison's, named, ironically, after the inventor who was famous for failing 1,000 times before success. But unlike Edison, Holmes and her team weren't iterating toward a real breakthrough. They were desperately trying to make the illusion hold together. Inside the labs, engineers fought a losing battle. The machines overheated, leaked, and produced wildly inconsistent results. A test might work 1 hour and completely fail the next. It wasn't just a technical hiccup. It was a scientific impossibility. What Theranos claimed could be done simply couldn't be done with the technology that existed at the time. And yet, no one on the outside knew. Not the journalists, not the investors, not even many of the employees themselves. Because no one was allowed to know anything. The culture at Theranos wasn't one of collaboration. It was one of silence. Every employee was required to sign extreme confidentiality agreements that went far beyond standard non-disclosure contracts. Speaking about what happened inside those walls was forbidden, even with co-workers. Holmes had built a company where secrecy wasn't just policy, it was religion. The teams were split apart by design. Engineers were isolated from the chemists. The chemists were separated from the medical researchers. And the medical team had no idea what the hardware group was building. Nobody saw the full picture, and that was the point. If no one understood everything, no one could piece together the truth. Some employees described the atmosphere as suffocating, others as cult-like. You could feel the tension in the air, the fear of saying the wrong thing, of being watched, of being replaced. Everything inside Theranos was controlled. Access badges tracked movement. Conversations were monitored. Even the emails were filtered and archived for review. People whispered in hallways, exchanged glances, and kept their doubts buried. Because at Theranos, questioning the mission meant questioning Elizabeth Holmes. And that was unthinkable. She had cultivated an aura of near-messianic authority. Her confidence was absolute, her certainty unshakable. When she said the technology worked, people believed her, even when the evidence in front of them said otherwise. And that's where Elizabeth truly excelled. Because she understood that people don't believe facts, they believe confidence. When you look certain, when you sound certain, when you feel certain, people will follow you anywhere. Holmes knew this instinctively. She gave everyone around her the illusion of progress, the feeling that they were part of something extraordinary. She didn't need to prove that the technology worked. She only needed to prove that she believed it did. When investors came to visit the lab, the tours were choreographed like stage plays. They weren't shown the real tests. They weren't told that the machines were failing behind the scenes. Instead, they saw flawless demonstrations, mock tests designed to impress. The samples they thought were being processed inside the Theranos devices were often rerouted secretly to conventional lab machines hidden in the background. When those real machines produced results, Holmes' team would print them and present them as proof that the Edison device had done the work. Investors left amazed, convinced they had witnessed the future of medicine. They saw what Holmes wanted them to see, a slick, seamless operation led by a genius. They didn't see the nervous engineers recalibrating broken machines or the scientists quietly crying frustration after weeks of failed trials. They didn't see the technicians staying up all night trying to make the numbers match the narrative. All they saw was the illusion, and that illusion was powerful enough to make billionaires write blank checks. When the machines failed in real-world tests, the company doubled down on deception. Instead of admitting the flaws, Holmes' team found workarounds to hide them. They diluted blood samples to make the numbers appear consistent. They cherry-picked data to create the illusion of accuracy. They manipulated internal reports and produced slides that showcased perfect performance curves, graphs that didn't exist in reality. It was deception disguised as innovation, failure dressed up as progress. The genius of it all was that Holmes had wrapped the deceit in the language of disruption. Every question was met with the same defense. You just don't understand the vision yet. Anyone who doubted her was branded as negative, uncooperative, or not bold enough to believe. And because her image as a visionary was so strong, most people didn't push back. They didn't want to risk being on the wrong side of history. Behind the glass walls, the truth was simple and devastating. The miracle machine that was supposed to change the world didn't work. The technology that had been hailed as revolutionary was little more than smoke and mirrors. But as long as Elizabeth Holmes stood on stage, calm and unwavering, wearing her black turtleneck and promising a better future, no one dared to see what was really there. But no one questioned it. Not the investors, not the journalists, not even Walgreens, the billion-dollar company that partnered with Theranos to put blood testing machines in its stores across America. Why? Because they wanted it to be true. It was a story that sold itself. A brilliant young woman taking on a medical establishment with courage, intelligence, and heart. And in that illusion, everyone saw what they wanted to see. This is where the Mirage became unstoppable. Elizabeth appeared on magazine covers, panels, and interviews. She was praised as the next Steve Jobs, the new Einstein, the woman who could change medicine forever. The more people heard about her, the more real she became. Media attention created validation, and validation brought more investors, which brought more money, which brought more credibility. The story fed itself like a loop, a self-sustaining illusion, and Elizabeth Holmes knew exactly how to keep it spinning. But no story built on illusion can last forever. Inside Theranos, cracks were beginning to show. Employees who dared to question the science were silenced, fired, or forced out. Some left in fear, others in guilt. One young employee, Tyler Schultz, the grandson of former Secretary of State George Shultz, who sat on Theranos' board, discovered inconsistencies in the test results and tried to warn his grandfather, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. George Shultz, like so many others, couldn't believe that the woman he admired could be lying. Tyler eventually became one of the whistleblowers who helped expose the truth, but not before facing immense pressure and legal threats. The illusion finally began to crack when journalist John Carreiro from the Wall Street Journal started digging. He received a tip from a former employee that the company's technology didn't work. Carreiro began investigating quietly, collecting testimonies, lab reports, and first-hand accounts. When his first article was published, it sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley and the medical world. For the first time, the curtain had been pulled back, and behind it was chaos. Theranos denied everything, of course. They fought back not with data, but with defiance. Elizabeth Holmes took to the airwaves, her composure unshaken, her tone calm but firm, her confidence radiating like armor. She appeared on television screens across America, looking straight into the camera with those unblinking blue eyes, and declaring that the company was under attack by people who simply didn't understand innovation. It was the same strategy that had worked so well before, reframed out as ignorance, criticism as fear, and scrutiny as resistance to progress. "This is what happens when you threaten to change the world," she said, her voice steady, almost rehearsed, as though she were reciting a truth only she could see. But this time, the spell didn't work. The charm that had shielded her for years was beginning to crack, and the world was finally starting to look closer. For the first time, her words were met not with applause, but with investigation. Federal regulators began descending on Theranos facilities, clipboards in hand, eyes sharp and skeptical. What they found behind the glossy PR veneer was chaos. The supposedly revolutionary devices were malfunctioning, producing inconsistent and often wildly inaccurate results. Inspections revealed rooms filled with faulty equipment, mislabeled samples, and improvised workarounds that broke every rule of medical testing. The company's operations weren't just flawed, they were dangerous. The deeper the investigators dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Internal records showed tests being run and rerun until desired numbers appeared. Quality control reports were ignored or altered. Data was massaged to look clean and consistent for investor presentations. In some cases, test results were so unreliable that they contradicted themselves within the same sample batch. The dream that Holmes had sold so confidently was disintegrating under the weight of hard evidence. But the human cost was what truly shattered the illusion. Real patients had relied on Theranos tests. Ordinary people who believed they were getting accurate information about their health. Some were told they had life-threatening diseases that they didn't actually have. Imagine being told you might have cancer or a severe hormonal imbalance based on a faulty reading. Others were falsely reassured that everything was fine, when in reality, something was seriously wrong. For them, the collapse of Theranos wasn't just financial, it was personal, and in some cases, life-altering. As stories of misdiagnosis and emotional devastation surfaced, public trust began to evaporate. The once celebrated prodigy who had graced magazine covers and headline conferences now found herself under a microscope. Journalists who had once praised her vision now dug into her contradictions. Scientists who had been silenced began speaking out. The facade was collapsing from every angle, but Holmes refused to let it show, even as evidence mounted. Even as the walls closed in, Elizabeth Holmes continued to project confidence. It was as if denial had become her final performance. She still wore the same black turtleneck, still spoke in the same deliberate tone, still invoked the mission as her moral shield. "We're going to fix this," she said in interviews, smiling softly, as if everything was just a temporary setback. Her team was fracturing, her investors were panicking, and regulators were circling, but she refused to break character. To the very end, she clung to the persona she had built, the visionary misunderstood by the world she was trying to save. But illusion, no matter how perfectly crafted, cannot stand forever against reality. In 2018, the end finally came. Theranos was dissolved quietly, almost tragically, like the fading of a once bright star. The company that had been valued at $9 billion just a few years earlier was now worth less than the paper its stock certificates were printed on. Investors who believed in Holmes's vision lost everything. Hundreds of millions gone overnight. Walgreens, which had partnered with Theranos to bring testing centers into its stores, shut down all remaining operations. The dream that had promised to revolutionize healthcare was officially dead. Then came the reckoning. Elizabeth Holmes and her former partner and COO, Sunny Balwani, were indicted on multiple counts of fraud. The charges weren't vague. They were detailed, deliberate, and devastating. Prosecutors accused them of lying to investors, deceiving doctors, falsifying data, and endangering patients. The courtroom became the stage for a story that was almost too cinematic to be real. Lawyers presented a trail of internal emails, lab reports, and testimonies from former employees. Piece by piece, the truth unfolded. Holmes had not only known that the technology didn't work, She had actively misled people to keep the illusion alive. The emails were damning. In one, an employee warned that the blood tests were failing quality checks. In another, Holmes brushed off concerns, instructing her team to stay the course and trust the process. Internal memos revealed that she had seen the inconsistencies firsthand, that she had been aware of the faulty data used in demonstrations, and yet continued to claim publicly that Theranos devices were 100% accurate. The prosecution's narrative was clear. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was manipulation. For years, Holmes had been the face of innovation. Now she was the face of deception. The woman who once inspired young entrepreneurs and earned comparisons to icons like Jobs and Musk was now being compared to con artists and schemers. The irony was brutal. She had built an empire on the promise of truth through technology, only to be undone by the very truth she tried to hide. Even as the verdict loomed, Holmes maintained that she never intended to deceive anyone. She spoke of her passion, her dream, her belief that the technology could have worked if only she'd had more time. But the evidence was overwhelming. The story she had written for herself, the prodigy, the disruptor, the savior, had been rewritten by reality. When the judgment was finally handed down, the illusion of Elizabeth Holmes, the visionary, was gone. What remained was Elizabeth Holmes, the defendant, a woman who had learned, too late, that confidence can command attention, but it cannot erase the truth. The trial was gripping. A real-life drama where the woman once hailed as a genius was now portrayed as a master manipulator. Holmes's defense claimed she was a victim of abuse and control by Balwani, but the evidence painted a more complex picture, one of ambition gone unchecked, a visionary who began to believe her own story. When she was finally convicted in 2022, the image of the confident visionary was gone. What remained was a woman whose myth had devoured her reality. But here's the question that still haunts Silicon Valley. Why did everyone believe her? Why did so many smart people, scientists, investors, journalists, fail to see the truth? The answer lies in something deeper than greed or ignorance. It lies in our collective desire to believe in miracles. We live in an age where attention is a new currency, and Elizabeth Holmes understood that better than anyone. She didn't sell science. She sold hope. She sold the dream that a single drop of blood could save lives. And in that dream, we all became complicit. The Theranos story isn't just a tale of fraud. It's a mirror. It reflects how we choose stories over skepticism, emotion over evidence. It's about how charisma can cloud judgment, how narrative can overpower truth. Because when someone tells us they can change the world, we want them to be right. We crave disruption, innovation, and the promise of something revolutionary. But as Theranos proved, the line between vision and delusion is razor thin. And that's the real tragedy of Elizabeth Holmes. She might have started with genuine passion. She might have truly believed she could change the world. But somewhere along the way, the story became more important than the science. The image became more important than the truth. And when you start believing your own myth, reality stops being a limit. It becomes an inconvenience. Today, Elizabeth Holmes' name is synonymous with deception, but the deeper truth is that she was a product of her environment, a Silicon Valley culture that rewards bold claims, punishes doubt, and worships confidence. She didn't just play the game, she played it perfectly, until the very end. When the cameras turned off, when investors who once hung on every word quietly withdrew their money, and when the pristine white labs that had once buzzed with the promise of revolution fell silent, what remained was not innovation. It was a haunting echo of ambition gone too far. The empty rooms of Theranos stood as monuments to belief, deception, and the fragile line between the two. The same energy that had built an empire, charisma, storytelling, and seduction of possibility, had now turned inward and consumed it. Attention had been Elizabeth Holmes' greatest weapon. With it, she had raised hundreds of millions of dollars, courted some of the most powerful people in the world, and reshaped how Silicon Valley thought about possibility. But attention, as it turned out, is a double-edged sword. The same spotlight that had once elevated her into a symbol of genius now exposed every crack in her story. Every headline that once praised her brilliance became a mirror reflecting her downfall. It was proof that in an age driven by perception, the truth always finds its way to the surface. no matter how deeply it's buried beneath charm and confidence. Theranos was built not on science, but on narrative. It was a story told so beautifully, so convincingly, that people wanted it to be true. Investors didn't just buy into a company. They bought into a dream, into a woman who spoke with conviction about changing the world with a single drop of blood. It was the perfect fairy tale for a tech-obsessed world that worshipped disruption over discipline, image over integrity. But science doesn't bend to storytelling. It doesn't care how inspiring a founder sounds or how sleek the pitch deck looks. The truth doesn't negotiate. As the myth unraveled, what emerged wasn't just a cautionary tale about one woman's lies. It was a reflection of an entire culture that rewards appearance over authenticity. We live in an age where perception is power, where social media can turn ambition into authority, and where storytelling often outpaces substance. Elizabeth Holmes didn't invent that culture. She mastered it. And in mastering it, she revealed its darkest flaw. The more convincing the illusion, the harder the fall when reality returns. The legacy of Theranos is not just about fraud. It's about belief. It's about the millions of people who wanted to believe that something extraordinary was possible. It's about the journalists who hesitated to question, the investors who didn't demand proof, and the public who saw in Holmes the next great visionary. The story endures not because of the lies, but because of what those lies say about us. Our hunger for heroes, our fascination with genius, and our willingness to trade truth for inspiration. When the dust settled and the last vestiges of the company were auctioned off, what was left wasn't a tragedy of science. It was a tragedy of storytelling. A reminder that in the world of startups and spectacle, attention can build empires, but it can just as easily destroy them. In the end, Elizabeth Holmes became a mirror reflecting the world that created her. She showed us that in a culture obsessed with speed, secrecy, and success, the line between vision and illusion can vanish in an instant. Her story isn't just about deception. It's about what happens when we stop asking questions, when we choose a story we want to believe instead of truth that's right in front of us. So the next time you hear about a revolutionary startup promising to change the world, pause for a moment. Don't just ask whether it's inspiring. Ask whether it's real. Don't just be moved by the dream. Demand the evidence. Because behind every glossy presentation, every bold claim, and every next big thing, there might be another mirage waiting to vanish. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of Theranos. That stories, no matter how beautiful or persuasive, cannot rewrite the laws of science. Reality doesn't bend to willpower, and progress cannot be built on pretense. The truth may move slower than ambition, but it always arrives. Eventually, Elizabeth Holmes's truth is a simple yet devastating one. Sometimes, the most dangerous illusion isn't the one you sell to others. It's the one you sell to yourself. And that's the untold story of Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos Mirage. If you found this story eye-opening, insightful, or even shocking, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? Was Elizabeth Holmes a visionary who lost her way, or a master manipulator who knew exactly what she was doing? Share your opinions in the comments below. I read every one of them. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the storytelling, and share it with someone who loves deep, thought-provoking stories like this. And if you want to keep uncovering the untold truths behind the world's most shocking tech scandals and business betrayals, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because more stories are coming. And trust me, you want to stay surprised.